Well, good morning. As you're finding your seat, before we just jump into the book of Hebrews, thought maybe just take a minute and kind of give a little background, little kind of history of where this book came from and what's going on here, and then we can kind of get into it. And the first thing really is probably more questions than answers because we're not even really sure who the author of this book is. Some think it could be Paul. Some say Barnabas. Some people even think it might be Luke. But there's nothing that tells us really who this is. Some of the other letters that are written that we see in the New Testament, some that Paul wrote, they start off by I, Paul, an apostle of the Lord Jesus Christ. First Peter starts off with Peter, an apostle of the Lord Jesus Christ. And so in some of the letters, we see that, they designate themselves, they identify themselves as the author of these letters. But we don't have that in this case. And one thing that creates even more challenges for for figuring out who this author is that because of the literary style, because of the way the letters formed, it doesn't match up with any of the other authors very clearly. And so it's hard to really say who it is exactly. The other thing that we really don't know is exactly who this is written to. Again, some of the other letters we have, the book of Ephesians is called the book of Ephesians because it's written to the church in Ephesus, or the book of Philippians is called the book of Philippians because it's written to the church in Philippi. But we don't have any thing that tells us exactly who this might be written to as far as a particular church or city. Or anything like that. But one thing that we do know about the audience that the book of Hebrews is writing to, one thing that we can discern from the content of the letter of this book is that it's written to those who are Jewish, who have a Jewish background. And the reason we can be certain that that's the case is two things. One is Hebrews is full of Old Testament scriptures. More than, I think, probably more than any other of the New Testament books. It's that the author's constantly referring back to the Old Testament to make his point in this letter. And so the way he writes it, he believes his audience has an understanding of these Old Testament scriptures. And so that would typically be someone who has a Jewish background, who grew up in the synagogue, who had been taught by the rabbis and came from that Jewish background. The Gentiles, anybody who's not Jewish is a Gentile, and the Gentiles wouldn't have had that same familiarity with the Old Testament scriptures. The other thing that we see in this book that helps us identify that these were somebody with a Jewish background is that the author also, you're going to see as we go through this book, that he's referencing some of the historical lineage, some of the characters that we see in the Old Testament. He references Abraham and Moses and the Israelites wandering through the wilderness. And he's writing it, again, in a way that he believes his audience is familiar with who these particular people are. And so we can be pretty certain that he's writing to those who are Jewish. One other thing that's probably important just to point out as we go into this book, it helps us understand why the book was written and why it was written the way that it was written, because it's not just written to those who are Jewish, but it's written to those who are Jewish and have now placed their faith in Jesus. And so it's these Jewish people who have now converted to Christianity. They have now placed their faith in Jesus. And at that time, specifically, that was a big deal. If you were Jewish and you placed your faith in Jesus, that wasn't a simple matter because of all the traditions and the laws that were within the Jewish culture. That this would have been almost like you are rejecting your upbringing. Because of the Jewish community, the Jewish culture, the Jewish traditions, the Jewish laws, the Jewish religion, they're all intertwined. And they didn't separate those. And so when you were converting to Christianity, you weren't just talking about your religious beliefs. You were talking about your whole upbringing, your whole heritage, the whole lineage. And so if you were a Jew at that time and placed your faith in Jesus, you were considered by your community a traitor. And so because of that, there would have been a lot of rejection. You would have been rejected by your community, but you probably were also rejected by your family. You probably, if you had a job, you were probably fired if you were working within the Jewish community. If you had a business, no one was going to buy your goods. And so you were going to have a difficult time making a living. And so these Jews who have now placed their faith in Jesus, they're under heavy persecution. I mean, this is real life difficulties for these. And not only just rejection from your family, but some were even being put in prison and physically attacked. And so one of the key verses that we're going to look at a couple key verses just to kind of give us a picture of what Hebrews is all about. And one of those key verses that explains kind of the dynamic that's going on here is Hebrews 10, verses 33 and 34. I have it up on the screen. And it says this: sometimes being publicly exposed to reproach and affliction, sometimes being partners with those so treated. For you had compassion on those in prison, and you joyfully accepted the plundering of your property, since you knew that you yourselves had a better possession and an abiding one. And so the author here is reminding them of some of the persecution that they've experienced in the past. But it wasn't just past persecution that he was reminding them of, because in Hebrews 13:3, he's talking about some current persecution as well. And Hebrews 13:3 says this: remember those who are in prison as though in prison with them, and those who are mistreated, since you also are in the body. And so the persecution was happening in the past, but it's also, there's still some who are in prison, who are being in prison. There's still some who are being mistreated. And so this persecution has been happening for a while. And so that's the context in which this book is written. It's written to these Jewish followers of Jesus who are under this heavy persecution. And because of this persecution, they're starting to get a little weary. It's starting to weigh on them. And because of this persecution, some are beginning to turn away from their faith in Jesus and going back to the way things used to be. The problem isn't, he's not just trying to remind them of the persecution, right? It's not just that. He's also pointing out the problem, the issue, which is they are now turning away from Jesus to go back to some of what they knew. Another key verse that kind of lets us know what's happening with these Jewish believers who have placed their faith in Jesus. Hebrews 10:35 says this: therefore do not throw away your confidence, which has a great reward. Hebrews 4:14 says the same thing in a little different way. Since then we have a great high priest who has passed through the heavens, Jesus, the Son of God. Let us hold fast our confession. And so we have these Jewish Christians, these Jewish followers of Jesus. They're under this heavy persecution. They're starting to feel the weight of it. They're starting to turn away from Jesus to go back to what they knew in their past, right? And before we judge them too harshly, right, try and it's hard. We're not under the same circumstances they were in, but try and put yourself in their shoes, right? They've lost everything. They've lost their community. They've lost their support system. They've lost their families. They've lost their way to make a living. Their property's being taken. Everything they have has been plundered. They have nothing. Like this is about as difficult as it gets. And so, right, can we imagine, right, might some of the thoughts that ran through their head run through our head, like, you know what, life was a little easier before Jesus, right? What if I turn away from Jesus and go back to the way things were? If I were to reject Jesus, would my community take me back in? Would I be able to now make a living and feed my family? Might the pain go away if I do this over here? And so that's the situation that they're in. That's the problem that they're facing. That's why the author has written this book, is because of what is happening with these Jewish believers. But, right, he doesn't just point out the problem and leave them to figure it out, right? He's got a solution for their problem. And so he goes on in Hebrews 10, verse 36, another one of those key verses that kind of helps us understand where we're going here. His solution is this: for those who are being persecuted and starting to grow weary and starting to lose faith, the answer is this: for you have need of endurance. You have need of endurance. You have need to endure in your faith, to keep going in your faith. I know I've said this several times in the past, and I'll say it again, right? God never asks us to do anything and leaves us in our own ability and strength to figure out how to do it. He always gives us the resources we need. And so where is this endurance that they're supposed to have come from? Where are they supposed to get this endurance? Is it something that they're supposed to manufacture and just kind of by the power of their will create within themselves? Here's another key verse, right? This is the answer to the solution is they need to endure. The way that they get the endurance we see in probably the key verse to Hebrews is found in Hebrews 12:2, and it says this: let us fix our eyes on Jesus, the author and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy set before him endured the cross, scorning its shame, and sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. Let us fix our eyes on Jesus, the author and perfecter of our faith. And I can't wait to get to Hebrews 12 so that we can talk about that. But today, we're just kind of giving an overview. We're kind of setting the stage for what's to come. The need is for them to have endurance in their faith. The way that they get it is by fixing their eyes on Jesus. So for those of you who like visuals, right, here's Hebrews. It looks like this. Right? The problem is that they were turning away from Jesus. The problem wasn't the persecution. The persecution wasn't the problem. The problem is that because of the persecution, they were turning away. And so we're going to see he's not trying to solve their persecution. He's trying to solve their problem, which is turning away from Jesus. And the solution is endurance. They're in need of endurance. And the way that we get endurance is by fixing our eyes on Jesus. That's the answer. That's the action. That's the application, is to fix our eyes on Jesus. And because that is the action that he's encouraging, exhorting them to take, he spends the first 10 chapters of this 13-chapter book talking about why we need to fix our eyes on Jesus, because he is greater than all else. He's greater than everything else, that in him we have the answers. The answers aren't back here somewhere. The answers aren't going back. There is no salvation. There's no eternal life. There's no abundant life in going back. It's all found in Jesus. And so, right, so we have this book. We have these Jewish believers who are under heavy persecution, who are turning away from Jesus, who are in need of endurance, and the way they get endurance is by fixing their eyes on Jesus. So what in the world does this book have to do with us? Most of us aren't Jewish. Most of us aren't under this type of heavy persecution. What in the world does a book like this have to do with a small church family like us in central Oklahoma, where Christianity, even if everybody doesn't go to church and follow Jesus, at least it's accepted in society. Christianity's certainly accepted in our culture. And so why does this book matter to us? Well, here's the reason, right? Life is hard. There are challenges of life. There are trials that we face all the time. There's temptation that we're constantly under. And some of us might actually be under some type of persecution as well. And so when these challenges come, when these trials come, when the temptations come, when the persecution comes, just like these believers back when this book was written, we can get weary. And we might not consciously say that we are going to turn away from Jesus, but it's still possible for us, because when difficulties come, when the challenges of life come, right, we are drawn back to, we tend to go to the things that we're comfortable with, the things that are familiar, the things that will help relieve some of the pain that we might be feeling. And listen, it's in us to say, look, what can I do to stop the suffering? What can I do to stop the pain? And so sometimes, even if we don't verbally say, hey, I'm going to turn my back on Jesus, I'm going to deny him, and I'm going to go back, right? Sometimes our words or our actions speak louder than our words. Right? Let me give you a for instance. Right? Let me talk about some obvious things that maybe we can do that we would even label sin, right? So for instance, right, when I'm feeling the stress of life or the pressures of life, I might turn to a drink, right? I might go to a drink to help numb some of the pain, to help take the sting out of the challenges of life that is facing me. And listen, I'm not picking on any particular group. I'm not picking on any particular thing that we might go to. Listen, I'm going to do my best to be an equal opportunity offender today. I'm going to step on as many toes as I can. And the reason is because we all have this in us, right? This isn't to single anybody out, right? It's because we all have this in us. So maybe alcohol's not your thing, right? But maybe gambling is, right? Maybe we scratch off the cards, or we go to the casinos thinking that, well, one, we might solve some of our financial problems, or at least distract us from the pain that we're going through. Maybe it's the internet, right? How we use the internet to kind of distract ourselves right? Pornography is a big issue that we're not going to dig into these today, but those are just some. There's even some less obvious ones that we go to when the stress of life comes, right? We eat. And there's nothing wrong with eating. We need to eat. But when that becomes the thing that we go to for faith, we put our faith in our eating to relieve the pain rather than putting our faith in Jesus, we are actually turning our back and putting our faith into something else. Maybe it's not eating, right? And these are kind of less obvious. Maybe it's your career. Right, well, let me just avoid the problems over here, and I'm just going to do what I do best, and I'm going to go do my job, and I'm just going to immerse myself in that because I don't want to have to deal with the other things of life. Maybe it's prescription medicine to relieve some of the pain. Maybe it's, don't yell at me, maybe it's shopping. Right? We all need to shop. It's shopping, prescription medicine, careers. None of those things in themselves are wrong. But when they replace Jesus, as far as our faith is concerned, right, that's where we are turning away from Jesus and we are putting our faith in something. And it's just like these Jewish believers. How can I relieve the pain? So, Book of Hebrews reminds us that Jesus is greater, that he's superior to any of these things, that Jesus is above all else. He's above the persecution, the trials, anything that we can use to kind of relieve the pain. And today, right, today and the following weeks, right, is not about making anybody feel guilty. It's not about causing you to feel shameful. I don't even want you to be afraid of God. I don't want you to feel like you need to be afraid of God, right? Because the book of Hebrews is all about hope. That the author isn't trying to remind them of the persecution and them being weary and turning away from Jesus to condemn them. He's presenting the book of Jesus because he wants to give them hope, and their hope is found in Jesus because Jesus is greater than all else. And so in the midst of the trying times for these Jewish believers, in the midst of some of the most trying times, he is giving them hope. And so if they have hope in their situation, we certainly have hope in whatever challenges and trials and temptations we might be facing. And so for you today, right? Life might be hard. And if it is, right, you're in the right place, right? Because this is the book that we want to be talking about. Now, if life isn't hard right now, if life is good, right? If there's no temptations that you are coming after you, right? You might be deceiving yourself, but life might be good for you, and that's great if that's true, right? As we go through the book of Hebrews, right? Then as we're learning, as we're seeing the answers to these challenges, put them in your tool belt, because difficulties of life will come. That's just the way it is, right? It ebb and flows. It's up and down, peaks and valleys. And you are going to have these in your tool belt so that when the difficulties of life come, you have what you need to go through them. So here's the plan. Here's the plan for the next few weeks. We're going to go through the book of Hebrews. Obviously, there's more in it than we're ever going to be able to do, and it would take us a couple years if we really hit all the details. The plan is to try and do a chapter a week. So that's 13 weeks, chapter a week. There are going to be some weeks along the way that we know we're going to stop and talk about something else and then pick up the book again. We've got Easter in there. We know we have a couple missionaries coming back. Eric Smith is coming in town in March. We've got the Blocks, Todd and Amy Block from Guatemala, Village of Hope, who are going to be here in April. And man, we definitely want to give them an opportunity to address you all and get to know them a little bit. So there's going to be some things along the way that we'll stop and start. But God willing, according to the plan, we're going to try and take a chapter a week. And that will get us to about the 1st of June. Or somewhere around that. So what I want to encourage you to do is you're going to be able to kind of guess where we're at, see where we're at. Don't even have to guess. You'll kind of see where we're at, what's coming up. And I'm just going to encourage you to read along with us, right? To even go ahead and read the next chapter ahead of time and get familiar with the chapter, because the more familiar you are with what's happening, the more you're going to get out of Sunday mornings. And so I just want to encourage you to do that. And so with just the couple minutes I got left, I just want to jump right into Hebrews 1. Just got a few minutes left, but Hebrews 1, verse 1, he just jumps right in and he starts talking about the very thing that he's going to be talking about for the next chapter, and that is that Jesus is greater than all else, that he's greater than all things. So if you have your Bibles, we'll have the verses on the screen, but Hebrews 1, verse 1, he starts off by saying this. Long ago, and in many times and in many ways, God spoke to our fathers by the prophets. And so right off the bat, he's linking the past to the present. He's saying that in the past, the prophets used to speak to our fathers, and he's talking about their ancestors, their fathers, grandfathers, all the Jewish lineage, that these prophets would speak to them. And these prophets that he's referring to are that they prophesied about the coming Messiah, that they were talking about this coming Messiah that was coming sometime in the future. And we know, in hindsight, that the Messiah he was talking about is Jesus. And so these prophets did what they were supposed to do. They told of this coming Messiah that was coming. But now, Jesus has arrived. And so the prophets have done what they're supposed to do, but now we have the real thing. We don't just have prophecy about Jesus. Jesus is here. And in verse 2, he goes on and he says, but in these last days, he has spoken to us by his Son. And so the prophets had done what they were supposed to do. They prophesied of the coming Messiah, but now their job was finished, because we now have Jesus, the Messiah, the one that they were prophesying about. So there's nothing left to prophesy about a coming Messiah, because he's already here. And so he's saying, listen, Jesus is greater than these prophets, because he's the very one that they were prophesying about. And there's no going back to the prophets, because Jesus has come. And there's nothing that they have to offer. There's no value in them. The value now is in something greater, which is in Jesus, the one that they actually were prophesying about. He goes on and he says, because not only is he, and some were saying he was just another prophet, right? Some were saying he's just another teacher, another prophet. And from the very beginning, say, no, he's not another prophet. He's the one that they were prophesying about. And so, and not only is he just not a prophet or a good teacher, he's actually God himself, because he goes on and he says, but in these last days he has spoken to us by his Son, whom he appointed the heir of all things. And so Jesus has been appointed heir of all things. And when we think of an heir, we think of an inheritance, and we think more in terms of material goods. Like when somebody in your family dies and they leave you an inheritance, you get their, some of their property or some of their material things, but don't think of an heir in terms of material possessions, because what he's talking about here is authority. Like if you were left, your parents died or whatever, and you now inherit their estate, right? You have authority over those matters, their home, their business, whatever that is. And so what he's talking about here is that Jesus has authority over all things. Let me give you an example in Matthew to maybe help illustrate this. We're all familiar with Matthew 28, 19 and 20. Therefore, go and make disciples, baptizing them in the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. The reason that we are able to go and make disciples, that's verse 19, it's because of what he says in verse 18, which we tend not to talk about as much for some reason. But let me just read Matthew 28, 18. It's not on the screen. Let me just read it to you. Then Jesus came to his disciples and said, all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Go therefore and make disciples of all the nations. So we're able to go and do what Jesus has asked us to do, to go make disciples, because we don't go in our own authority, we don't go in our own strength, we don't go in our own ability. We go on the authority of Jesus, that Jesus has authority over all things. We know he has authority over the storms, right? We see that in Peter walking on the waves and sinking. We see where he calms the seas, right? He has authority even over the storms of life. He has authority over the difficulties that we face, the things that we go through, the persecution, the trials. And the reason that he has authority over all those things is because he's the one who created them. It goes on. It says, whom he appointed the heir of all things, through whom also he created the world. And so everything that exists, right, it's because Jesus created. There's nothing that exists that he didn't create. And even, let me just take a step back even further. Not only did he create it, but he set it all in motion. And so there's nothing that doesn't exist outside of what Jesus created. Because sometimes we think our difficulties, our challenges, our trials somehow exist outside of Jesus and what all he created. But there's never a time where Jesus is caught off guard. There's never anything that surprises Jesus, because he's the one that created it. There's never a moment where Jesus is going to say, oh, wow, where did that come from? Or how in the world did that happen? Right? That's nothing will ever surprise him. He is fully aware. He's fully in control, and he has full authority over all things. Another point goes on in verse 3. Though through whom also he created the world, he is the radiance of the glory of God and the exact imprint of his nature. And so this Jesus that we see in the Bible, right, the way that he demonstrated love, the way that he extended grace and mercy, the way that he showed compassion, the way that he sacrificed himself for us. He was demonstrating, right, the exact imprint of the nature of God. He wasn't being an example of who God is. He wasn't sort of kind of like God. He was God. He was the exact imprint of his nature. If you remember a couple weeks ago, we talked about Moses being in the presence of God, and when he came out of the presence of God, his face was glowing from the glory of God reflecting in his face, but he was wearing this veil because the glory would fade, and he didn't want the people to see the fading glory. Well, that's not what's happening here, right? Jesus is he is God, and so therefore he is full of the glory of God. It never fades away from him. John 10:30 says this. It says, I and the Father are one. This is Jesus making this claim. I and the Father are one. They are one and the same. That the author here is giving Jesus his rightful place as being above all else, by having full authority, by being the creator of all things, by being the very God himself. He's greater than the prophets. He has authority over all things. And then if that wasn't enough, right, he puts an exclamation point on these first couple verses, and he says this, and he upholds the universe by the word of his power. That Jesus upholds the universe by the word of his power. So the sun, the stars that are in place, right? He created them all. He upholds them all. The planets that rotate around the sun, he created it. He upholds them all. The planets that we haven't even found yet, that are out in galaxies that we don't even know about, he has created them all, and he upholds it all. The earth circling around the sun at just the right distance in order to sustain life. He upholds it all. The molecules, the atoms, the DNA strands, the things that I can't even begin to understand, right, and wouldn't even know how to explain. He not only created it, but he upholds it all, and he upholds it all by his words, by just the power of his words. Love the way New Living Translation puts it. It says this, it says, he, Jesus, sustains everything by the mighty power of his command. By just his command, he sustains it all. He created it all. He upholds it all. He keeps it all going. And if we just stopped here, if we didn't go any further in Hebrews, right, is there anyone greater than the one who created everything and upholds it just by the power of his command? There's no one greater. I mean, we could literally stop here, but we're not going to, because we still got 12 more chapters to go. We're not going to, we're going to stop today. We're not going to keep going today, but we're going to keep going because the author has so much more to say about why Jesus is greater than all things. So we've got this, out of time, we've got these Jewish followers, right? And life could not be more difficult for them. This is real stuff. This is painful stuff. This is as difficult as it gets. And so just cute religious sayings, cliches, right? The saying things that we'd put on a poster or in a meme, right? They're not going to solve these guys' problem. They need real answers to what's going on for them. And so I don't know what your challenge is, right? And I don't want us to compare ourselves to what they're doing. Our problems are real. What we're going through is real, and we need real answers to our problems as well. And so that's what we're going to find as we go through the book of Hebrews. Right? I don't know what your challenges are. Maybe it's health, maybe it's finances, maybe it's relationships. I don't know what trials you're going through on your job or the fears that you might be facing. I don't know what temptations are coming at you just seem impossible to overcome, that there's just having difficult time finding victory in any of those things. I don't know what persecution you might be facing with rejection from family or maybe at school or at your workplace. Right? I don't know, but I do know that the solution is that we need endurance. We need to endure in our faith. And the way that we do that is by fixing our eyes on Jesus, because he is greater than everything else.